In the last lecture, we talked about primates being some proxy data for trying to understand who we are as humans. We're primates, and we have close relatives in living creatures that are also primates, especially the hominoids, our closest relatives, which are apes. Apes are only found in the Old World, that is to say Africa and Asia. And those are both, we know by testing genetics, are our closest relatives. We have the closest in terms of DNA to them, which means that we actually split fairly recently in the broad sense from a common ancestor with other primates. The most similar to us are chimpanzees and bonobos, about equally, about 98% similar in genetics. The less similar you are in genetics, the further in the past we shared a common ancestor. So we're not going to be very genetically similar to a sponge because it was a very, very long time ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, that we branched off and sponges went off in another direction. Now, we've looked at the principles of evolution, and we looked at it from a natural selection perspective, and that selects particular individual organisms to survive and reproduce. And the reproduction is very important because really that's the bottom line. Do your genes show up in the next generation? If you are successful, they do. If you are not successful, you're the last of that genetic line. And what determines success is based on what the environmental factors are. And those can be big, broad things like temperature or moisture or topography, big things like that. Or they can be just bad luck, that you're perfectly capable of surviving and getting resources and reproducing, and something happens. A rock falls on your head, and tough luck, you never get that chance to reproduce. So there's just a little bit of random chance that's involved in there as well. And so we've seen the process of evolution build from you were a single cell organism, and that had all of the genetic blueprints for how your body would be built. The developmental factors add variety and add chance to what is actually produced. And so your parents were successful at reproducing and creating you. And so you are the product of a successful generation, right? You then grow and survive, and it's up to you to reproduce or not. The environment weighs in on what product you become. Part of that is your own doing, but when you were an infant, you had to rely on your family and your community to care for you. That's the product of having a long childhood and a long period of socialization. One thing that we haven't really looked at, tackled very much, however, is the concept of, we've just been thinking of this biologically, and as I said in an earlier lecture, there's the biocultural approach that all physical anthropologists acknowledge that we are not just, and in fact most creatures are not just automatons, they're not just robots. You don't just have a gene that creates a genotype that creates a phenotype, and then that phenotype just spontaneously reproduces. It doesn't happen that way. You have to behave, and you have to act, and you have to do things, both to survive and to reproduce. And so it's your actions and your behavior that are also being naturally selected. Not all behaviors are genetic, though. Some of them are learned, but there are things like personalities can be passed down. When we come to our conversations on in several chapters on domestication, all dogs every dog in the world today is a descendant of a wolf. All these little pugs and dachshunds and things, going back far enough in time, it was a wolf. But there's a variety of behaviors that wolves have. You've got these nasty, biting, snipping, snarling, eat your throat kind of a wolf that you don't want to be anywhere near. They could kill you. But there are more docile, friendlier, and more compatible wolves to humans. And those are the ones that humans chose to be around and started to breed into the domesticated animals that we know today. And so you can actually, we were able to choose behavioral characteristics in wolves, and we chose the nicest ones that actually made it into a new species entirely, based on other physical characteristics as well. We choose to make them short and stumpy and have little pug faces and things that cause breathing problems for them. So this is a way to say that behavior is also part of this equation, right? You don't really think about a school of fish as something that is where they're deciding to school. This is something that if you are a fish that goes off out of your little cluster, you're vulnerable. Some dolphin is going to pick you off and you won't survive and reproduce. So the behavior of schooling, or birds that flock, or animals that herd, is a strategy of behavior that also results in survival and success in reproduction. So you can't take our actions out of this equation as well. But as we all know, your actions are in part programmed. You have things like breathing. Breathing is an action that you do that thankfully you don't have to think about, right? Breathing is something that if you didn't have it as an involuntary action, you would never go to sleep, or you certainly would not like to go to sleep, because we can't last for very long without breathing. When you feel hungry, that's a response to the fact that your body needs food to survive. And when you're thirsty, the same thing, for water to survive. And that prompts you. You feel uncomfortable when you're hungry or thirsty, and it prompts you to go out and find that resource to help you to live and survive. So, like I said, it's partly you feel hungry and you breathe because biology has ingrained that in you. There's also things like sex drive, which is your body telling you you better reproduce because you're not going to be around forever, and these genes won't survive into the next generation if you don't. So there's a lot of biological things that prompt you to behave in a particular way, but you also have the ability to choose your own path. And we can do things like we have monks and vows of celibacy that are totally anti-evolutionary. If we all decided we were going to be celibate, humans would go extinct in a generation. So we can choose to do that. That's possible, but it just means that we won't see our genes perpetuated. So this chapter is about behavior, but in the last chapter we looked at primate biology, but as an analog for how we can sort of compare ourselves in the present day to our closest relatives, but also how we can use them and the way they adapt to their environments to speculate about how some of our ancestors might have actually adapted some of their characteristics. We did that in the physiological sense last chapter, but now we're going to look at primate behavior. Now, in addition to this lecture, I've also made available a video which is from a BBC documentary series called Life of Mammals, and this particular one is called Social Climbers, and it's about this subject of the intersection between biological adaptations and social adaptations in primates, specifically looking at monkeys around the world. And so you can look at that video in terms of biology, but it would be great if I could take you all to South America and to the Thai forest in Africa or to Sri Lanka. If we could do that in a class, I would love to do that. But we don't have the time or the money or the resources to be able to do that in an introductory class. So thankfully, other people have done it for us. In this case, Sir David Attenborough, one of my personal heroes, who is the real deal. He's got PhDs in the relevant disciplines, and he's got a voice that would melt butter. So I hope you enjoy that video, and that will actually give you a little bit of something to look at in the description that I'm giving you here, other than just me. So I'm going to talk about what the textbook goes into and some of the things that we're going to test on, but I want you to watch that video because it's very illustrative of the points that I'm trying to say here. So let's start with simply, why are primates social? Not every animal is particularly social. You've got lots of solitary creatures that only just occasionally happen upon each other and mate and then go apart their ways, right? So bears are a good example of that. You don't really get clusters of bears. They tend to be fairly solitary, and a male will come across a female, they'll mate, and if they see each other again, that male may very well kill the cubs because they don't want competition, aren't sure that it's theirs, and they also don't want to compete for those resources that are in their territory. So it's not necessary that a mammal or even a large mammal has to be a social animal. But primates tend to be. And so why is that? So this is getting to the crux of why we live in communities and how we have survived as social creatures. And what's so special about primate societies and their social behavior? Ants are pretty social creatures. Is that the same kind of sociality, an ant colony, or a troop of baboons? Are they the same kind of social organization, social behavior? And then how does this relate to survival and acquisition of food and that sort of thing? Also, how does a community communicate and hold itself together? How does the functioning of primate societies work? So we looked at some of the physiology of primates in the last chapter, and there are some common characteristics that set them apart. One of them is that they actually have pretty big brains. They're pretty clever. They survive on a range of foods, and they find that range of foods by sort of figuring out the world around them. It may seem very clever for a cheetah to stalk its prey, but it's actually pretty mechanistic. They have kind of a one-trick pony, and if they don't do it that way, they really have no other way to get food. They only eat meat, and so primates are a little bit more, need to be a bit more versatile, and so a brain that can figure out the world is rewarded. But at the same time, that brain can be used for purposes that aren't just individual, but for interacting with their own kind, and even figuring out those that aren't of their own kind, as we'll see. So communication, primates can express themselves in a variety of ways, and we do it all the time. By you watching me, you're actually seeing my facial cues, my eyebrows raise, my lips are moving, my hands are moving around and doing gestures. You're getting those visual cues at the same time. If I were to just stand here and I were to just not do anything, you would probably find it really uncomfortable, and you probably wouldn't get as much out of what I'm talking about. Our expressiveness is something that enhances our communication, and primates do this all across the board. You touch one another, they groom one another, you can fight one another, you can greet, you can use your lips and smack things, and hugging even is an expressive behavior. And all of these things are ways to create social currency between each other, individuals, that can establish bonds or break those bonds and reinforce communities. So these groups and social behavior are built by communication between one another, individuals in a group. And you organize yourselves in these groups as well. This can be done by, are you an infant? Well, you have a lot of requirements. And that means that there's responsibility for other people to take care of you that are more capable. But at the same time, you also don't have the rank of an adult member of that group. So being a child, you are placed at a different level than an adult, but less is expected of you. So there's a lot of negotiation of place in societies. So kinship, rank, age, sex, all of these things are aspects that determine what place you are in that group. And that can have an effect on your survivability and success in an evolutionary sense. If you are of low rank in a ranked society, you may never get a mate. You may find yourself out of that system. And we see this in primate societies. Watch the video of the macaques at Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka, and you'll see all too human behavior that's pretty brutal. But it's also, having a clever brain means you can actually find ways around the system and cheat the system a little bit. Also, having a big brain means that you remember stuff. And primate social relationships tend to be long-term. So if you groom somebody, if you do favors for somebody, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, that creates a long-term bond. And this means that it can actually help with survival as well. If you help somebody in their time of need, when you need assistance, you might actually find a helping hand at that time as well. So social behaviors, like biology, evolves and is also impacted by natural selection and environmental factors. There is a part of these adaptations that is heritable. You can inherit this, but at the same time, it's a lot more plastic. Your behavior can change according to environmental circumstances. I'm wearing a short sleeve shirt today because it's actually getting quite warm out. But a few months ago, I would have been wearing a sweater or maybe a coat. So that's my decision to have a different social and cultural adaptation to changing environmental factors. Now that's kind of a facile one, but it illustrates that some things I can't change about me and my behavior and my personality, and some things I can very easily, and those means that I can overcome certain biological and environmental factors with those decisions that I make. Also, there's learned behavior. The fact that I'm speaking to you right now is a function of the fact that, first of all, I'm able to speak. I have a biological ability to do so, but I also went to school when I was a kid, and I learned how to speak and talk and communicate in this language, and so you can understand me. You also had that, so we both can understand one another. Even if we didn't go to school, we would probably be socialized into learning the kind of communication system that is most useful to us in our everyday environment. So our communication and our socialization is both a product of our genetic predispositions and our particular context or environment. Now, this may seem very abstract when we're talking about the very ancient past, but as I mentioned last last lesson, there are hints in the biology as to what kind of behaviors there are. So, for instance, I talked about the canines in the teeth, that lots of apes chimpanzees, gorillas have large canine teeth. Our canines are non-honing, and they are no bigger than any of the other teeth in our mouth. Now, what does that say about our behavior? At first glance, you might think nothing. But actually, while teeth are primarily for chewing food and getting access to nutrition and are sensitive to what your diet is like, once you have them, you can use them for other things. And by observing primates in their natural habitats, you can see that sexual relationships between gorillas usually tends to be in terms of harems. You have a single male and multiple females. And the males use their big fangs, their big canines, to intimidate males, to show their health and success, and impress females, and even sometimes to fight. They also, it also has a function for slicing into fruit. So yes, it has a function, but it's also used to establish relationships on a social level as well, and to maintain those social relations. Also, they're quite sexually dimorphic. That is to say, sexual dimorphism is a difference in size between a male and a female. So male gorillas are huge by comparison to females. And that's also indicative that males are successful if they can show their power and establish dominance over a group. They also have the support from that group, until another larger male comes in, jockeys for position, and fights them over it. So actually, by observing gorillas and other types of primates in their natural habitats, we can see that when you see see sexual dimorphism in primates, and when you see big canines in primates, you tend to have single male and multiple female social organizations. So that's what your group you live in is. You are a leader, and you've got your harem of females, but you're always on the lookout for males that are coming to compete with you. But that's not the only type of residence pattern. If you don't have a lot of sexual dimorphism in a primate group, you might actually have either monogamous relationships, or you might have multiple male, multiple female. So the types of bodies that you see are sometimes indicative of the kind of social behaviors that you have. We don't have a huge amount of sexual dimorphism in humans, and we don't have those powerful canines. And we tend to have